Conversations about Frank Herbert's Dune are often dominated by male characters. Your Paul Atreides, Leto II, Duncan Idaho, your Kwisatz Haderachs and Lisan al-Gaibs. And while these characters are incredibly important, I often find that the female characters in these stories get a little bit sidelined. This is odd, considering that Dune literally begins and ends with the words of powerful women. My working hypothesis is that characters like Jessica, Alia, Ghanima, and Chani tend to get swept under the rug because they're complex. The women of Dune are not easy to categorize. Dune was published in 1965, at the tail end of a wave of science fiction written for men and by men. It wasn't until the New Wave movement of the 1970s that these molds were broken a bit by authors like Ursula K. Le Guin, who wrote less masculine science fiction. But Dune was instrumental to mainstreaming science fiction that was feminist, or at least female-centric. And yet, I wouldn't try and say that Dune itself is feminist. I think it sits in a really interesting place of establishing a lot of feminist ideals, but also in the same breath subverting them and reinstating traditional patriarchal norms. And overarching all of this is a larger narrative about cyclical trauma. And while this inflicts itself upon all of the characters, male and female alike, I really think that this cyclical trauma comes to its zenith in the women of Dune. Often forced to step aside in the face of fate, these powerful women render themselves powerless, hiding in the shadows of greatness, a self-imposed exile into irrelevancy. Dune is all about systems and the abuse that they allow for. Systems of government, systems of religion, systems of relationships. And the women are just as hopeless as the men when it comes to escaping these systems. This video is going to cover books 1 through 3, and I will be giving spoilers for all of those. So if you want to avoid spoilers, I would leave this video and tune back in next week. But if you haven't read those books and you still want to watch the video, I'm going to try and give you enough context to understand what I'm talking about, hopefully without info dumping too much and boring everybody else who's watching this video. It is a delicate balance. A balance that I have not found yet. Oh, and also I will get around to talking about the Denis Villeneuve movies a little bit towards the end of this video, so stick around for that. As I said, Dune begins with a female voice, the voice of the Princess Irulan, who we won't actually meet until much later in the story. But even before meeting her, Frank Herbert establishes her as someone with authority, as a woman with a voice. The women of this world are respected historians and scholars. They have built a place for themselves. This notion of female empowerment is only enforced by the opening scene, where we see Jessica and the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam looking in at a sleeping Paul. The awakened boy could see a bulky female shape at his door, standing one step ahead of his mother. The old woman was a witch shadow, hair like matted spider webs, hooded round darkness of features, eyes like glittering jewels. The language evokes the arachnid, watching from the shadows with thousands of eyes as new prey falls into her web. We learn that the Reverend Mother is a member of the Bene Gesserit, arrived to test the mettle of our young protagonist. The Bene Gesserit are a very unique organization because they are immensely powerful, but it's in an underhanded way. Frank Herbert called the Bene Gesserit female Jesuits, and beyond just the similarity of name, this can tell us a lot about the function that the Bene Gesserit serve in the larger Imperium. Jesuits are an order of historical, and also modern-day, Catholic priests and brothers. They educate their members with the hope of eventually sending them out as missionaries, as educators themselves. They're an organization that has reach in a lot of places, but they're not necessarily outright seeking power. They support, they advise, they educate. And the Bene Gesserit do that and much, much more. The power of the Bene Gesserit stems from the way that they educate their members. They train them in language, in history, and culture, and also they train them in the mind and body. They are carefully conditioned until they have complete control over themselves, until they can control their bodies on a molecular level. Their understanding of the human body and mind allows them to also read other people, tracing minutiae in facial expressions, in pulse, in body language, to the point where they are accused sometimes of being able to read minds. This also lends them the power of the voice. They are able to manipulate their vocal tone in order to issue commands that no one can disobey. Bene Gesserit training results in abilities that might very well seem like magic if one is unaware of the training that's gone in behind it. Bene Gesserit are also missionaries of a sort, but they aren't there to spread the word of God. No, they position themselves in subtle places of power as truthsayers, advisors, educators, trusted guides. And from that, they can pull on the puppet strings of the universe. And on top of all of this, the Bene Gesserit are notably all women. And this is something that has forced them to be what they are, and has also allowed them to be what they are. The Imperium of Dune is unavoidably a patriarchy. The Emperor is a man. The houses follow a patrilineal rule. It wasn't feasible for the Bene Gesserit to claim power in an outright place. There's never going to be a Bene Gesserit emperor. And this means that they've had to resort to other methods. If they weren't seen as equals, at the very least, they would use their unique female traits to their advantage. We can already see this at work in their training, the way that they take these feminine traits and reverse them. Historically, as in going all the way back to the 17th century Enlightenment, the mind was considered superior to the body. The body was this animal thing, uncontrollable and irrational, but the mind could ascend. It was fair, it was rational, it wasn't tied to all of the gross earthly things of the body. Naturally, of course then, traditional thinking dictated that men were more in tune with their rational minds, and women were more in tune with their bodies. You know, they have periods, they get pregnant, all of these things taking them away from the possibility of rational thought. They were tied down to their bodies and thus slave to their hormones and thus lesser than men. But the Bene Gesserit take this traditional Western thinking and they flip it on its head. Their power comes from the very fact that their minds are not afraid of their bodies. Their bodies are not dead weight holding them back from true reason. They are carefully tuned machines ready to serve the desires and the reason of the mind. Bene Gesserit thinking proposes that, yes, maybe women are more in tune with their bodies, but maybe that is what makes them so strong. Likewise, their ability to reproduce, to have children, was once something that could be used to subjugate them, to control them, but they have turned it into a weapon. The main goal of the Bene Gesserit was to produce, through careful breeding, the Kwisatz Haderach, a chosen one who could change space and time and save humanity. The only reason that this is possible is because the Bene Gesserit are in control of all reproduction. They choose when they conceive a child, they choose who their partner is because they're really good at seduction, and they can choose what the gender of the child is because of their mind-body unity. Historically, women have been silenced and unheard, but the Bene Gesserit have found their voice. They have created a community of women working for and with other women. This idea is quite literally realized in the concept of the other memory. Once they have completed their training to a certain level, Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers take a poison. This poison, once they have transmuted it, opens their mind, allowing them access to the memories, the personalities, and egos of all of the female ancestors that have come before them. The Bene Gesserit function as one mind and one body, allowing them to play a chess game on the scale of the cosmos. I just love the complexity of the world building of Dune, especially the Bene Gesserit. And if you're looking for a game that also has really fun world building, you should check out this video's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus is a thrilling turn-based strategy game set in the eternal conflict of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Tacticus gives you tactical, fast-paced battlefield gameplay right in the palm of your hand, with over 70 champions to choose from and 17 playable factions. Both new and old fans of the Warhammer universe are going to find something to love with Tacticus, from game modes to guild raids, and constantly expanding content like game modes and events. If you want to give Tacticus a try, now's the time. Use my QR code right here or check out the link in my description to get started today. And as a special little present from me to you, you can use this code right here to get 2,000 gold and 50 black stones. But make sure you hop on that fast because it's only available until December 1st. Thank you so much to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Based on my explanation of the Bene Gesserit here, you'd be forgiven for seeing them as pretty progressive. Sure, it's based on the idea that men and women are fundamentally different, body, mind, and soul, which can get into some tricky dehumanization things if you're not careful, but overall, it's a group of powerful women who are using the tools that once subjugated them to create their own power. It's pretty cool. Unfortunately, the feminism of the Bene Gesserit organization starts to break down when you go from looking at it as a whole body to looking at an individual. And the first individual Bene Gesserit that we meet is the Lady Jessica, mother to Paul Atreides and concubine to Duke Leto Atreides. Jessica never knew her parents. She never had any family. Instead, she was put directly into the Bene Gesserit educational machine. She grows up powerful, skilled, unified in mind and body, but she is lacking love. And once her training is complete, she is literally sold off to the Duke Leto. It's very cold and callous. Sure, she and the Duke Leto fortunately end up falling in love with each other, but being Bene Gesserit means that she is excluded from certain pretty essential human experiences. The experience of growing up, of meeting someone, of falling in love and choosing to be with them. She never got to have that choice. Jessica and Duke Leto remain unmarried throughout their entire relationship because the Duke has to keep his hand available for a more politically advantageous union. She isn't his wife, they don't eat their meals together, and even in a huge house surrounded by servants, Jessica is incredibly lonely. The Bene Gesserit organization, whilst being powerful and in some ways empowering its students, also leaves them unable to form normal human relationships. It leaves them quintessentially alone. Pushed by some combination of love, pride, and rebellion, Jessica, for the first time, disobeys the order. She gives birth to a son, Paul, instead of the daughter that they had planned. And while I would love to call this an exciting act of empowerment for Jessica, the fact is that she did it for someone else. She did it because Leto wanted to have a son. And while the Duke loves her and he deeply appreciates this action, it doesn't necessarily bring them any closer together. This act of rebellion does nothing to free her from her role as Bene Gesserit. She remains an other, divided from her lover by an uncrossable barrier. Paul is a beautiful soul and a bright young student, but before long, Jessica's decision comes back to bite her. Paul is even more distant than Leto ever was, and this is thrown into stark contrast as he begins his journey towards being the Kwisatz Haderach, the Chosen One. Jessica sensed that his mind had leaped ahead of her, that it now saw more in some respects than she did. She had helped train the intelligence which did this, but now she found herself fearful of it. From the moment that Paul accepts his fate, he can no longer see his mother as his mother. She is simply another limb of the Bene Gesserit. Paul sat silently in the darkness, a single stark thought dominating his awareness. My mother is my enemy. She does not know it, but she is. She is bringing the jihad. She bore me. She trained me. She is my enemy. Whether or not Jessica intended it, she has imposed her fate onto her son. A life as other, never able to fully engage in the breadth of the human experiences. She has put a burden upon him far too large for any one person to bear. As a tool of the Bene Gesserit, Jessica cannot help but use everyone around her as another tool. No one is exempt from this, even people who have never even heard of the Bene Gesserit training. Out in the desert, Paul and Jessica meet a Fremen woman named Chani. Paul has seen in his visions that he and Chani are destined to be together, and they fall for each other really quickly. Within just days, Chani trusts Paul completely, believing that there is a cord of destiny tying the two of them together. She put a palm against his cheek. I'm no longer afraid, Usul. Look at me. I see what you see when you hold me thus. What do you see? He demanded. I see us giving love to each other in a time of quiet between storms. It's what we were meant to do. While this is a very sweet sentiment, I can't help but see it as a fairly unequal way to enter a relationship. Chani came into this story as a powerful and independent character of her very own. She had a personality. She was a highly trained Fremen warrior. But by meeting Paul and immediately agreeing to be his quiet between storms, I see this as Chani willingly setting herself aside. She implicitly understands that there's no way in which she could participate and help in Paul's larger universe-saving mission, and so she willingly lets herself be used as a tool, as something to come home to when the battle is done being fought. She's willingly allowing herself to be unequal to Paul, and, you might consider that the right thing to do, in that Paul does need this from her, but it is so unfair to who she is as an individual. It is tragically self-sacrificial. And Jessica, who can see all of this happening, only enforces it. She muses, "What can his desert woman do for a duke except serve him coffee?" she asked herself. She brings him no power, no family. Paul only has one major chance to ally himself with a powerful great house, perhaps even with the imperial family. There are marriageable princesses, after all, and every one of them Bene Gesserit trained. As long as Chani lives, Paul will not see his duty, Jessica thought. The irony of this thought is almost cruel. The exact same thing could have been said of Jessica when she first married the Duke Leto. She had no special wealth, no station or power. She just had who she was and what she is. What use is she outside of being a tool to produce the next powerful male heir? Whether or not she's aware of it, Jessica is perpetuating her own subjugation onto Chani, a willing victim. In the first book, in pretty short order, Chani bears Paul a son, but he is killed in the battle for Arrakis. Chani then watches on helplessly as Paul marries the Princess Irulan in order to secure his political position, and certainly Chani knows that Paul loves her, that it will always be the two of them, but this cements the idea that Chani is nothing more than a tool to him, a thoughtful, fertile companion, but not his wife. Not an equal. At the end of the first novel, Jessica offers Chani the only reassurance she knows how to give. Think on it, Chani. That princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know a moment of tenderness from the man to whom she's bound. While we, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives. That's an encouraging thought, and it's no doubt what Jessica has been telling herself for years, but how much of a consolation is it really? They are still others. They are still tools, having to watch from the shadows of their powerful men. They've gotten to the top, they have won on a grander scale, but on a personal level, they are still empty. What does it matter what history is going to call them when their own partners cannot even consider them equal? The process of Chani's othering continues into the second book, as Jessica abandons Arrakis entirely, and there we can see just how distant Chani and Paul have become. "You are my man," she said. "I know this, but suddenly I don't understand you." Abruptly, Paul felt that he had walked down a long cavern. His flesh moved, one foot and then another, but his thoughts went elsewhere. "I don't understand myself," he whispered. When he opened his eyes, he found that he had moved away from Chani. She spoke from somewhere behind him. "Beloved, I'll not ask again what you've seen. I only know I'm to give you the air we want." He nodded then. "I've known that from the beginning." He turned, studied her. Chani seemed very far away. With no hope of ever understanding Paul or his great mission, Chani sets her autonomy aside with a sigh, submitting completely to Paul's will. And, Paul loves her, of course. He says it all the time, which is a comfort, but who even is this man that Chani has fallen in love with? What storms did Paul see with his eyeless vision? Chani sensed a vicious madman in him, someone weary of songs and polemics. This quote rings eerily similar to some thoughts that Jessica had earlier about the Duke Leto. The Duke is really two men. One of them I love very much. He's charming, witty, considerate, tender, everything a woman could desire. But the other man is cold, callous, demanding, selfish, as harsh and cruel as a winter wind. The cycle simply continues. The woman stepping aside as the man that swore to love her becomes a stranger, being pulled further and further into the machinations of fate, and Chani's ties to Paul mean that she is pulled in after him. Desperate to provide an heir for Paul and rendered infertile by the meddling of Irulan, Chani begins doing an old Fremen fertility ritual, which involves consuming massive amounts of spice. This allows the pregnancy to progress, but it is unnaturally fast. The children are born, but Chani is killed in childbirth while Paul is off handling something more important, and she dies alone. This is, of course, a tragedy for Paul. It breaks him. It is the thing that forces his feet off of the golden path, but just for a moment, let's set aside Paul's feelings and what's going on with Paul, and just take a look at Chani. Chani, who was once a spirited, strong, independent Fremen woman whose only sin was falling in love with a boy. Chani, who lost one child and the hope of ever marrying her lover, all in one fell swoop. Chani, who had to watch as Paul drifted away into incomprehensibility. Chani, who died performing the one act of service that Paul still found her useful for. Paul loved her, of course, we know that, but I don't think that stops her from being a victim of the highest order. She was bulldozed by Paul and his wrestling with fate, completely sidelined, hidden, and choked out by his massive shadow. It is tragic, and it's even more tragic when you think about the people like Jessica who saw this happening and probably could have put a stop to it and didn't. And unfortunately, this tragic cycle doesn't end with Chani. It continues into her daughter, Ghanima. Ghanima came into this world with so much potential. Because of her mother's consumption of spice while she was in the womb, she is pre-born, meaning that in utero, her body was inundated with spice and her mind opened to the other memory of the Reverend Mothers. Ghanima bursts into this world with all of the nature and nurture and wisdom and inner strength to be the Kwisatz Haderach, the chosen one, but unfortunately, Chani had twins. And Ghanima had a twin brother, Leto II. Ghanima's name translates to spoil of war, and I hate to say it, but the name fits. Ghanima becomes second to her brother, following in his footsteps, watching as he drifts further and further away from her, as he turns himself into something that the entire universe will despise. At one point, she even has to hypnotize herself into believing that her twin brother has been killed. She puts herself through all of that agony, all to play her part in a plan that history will largely forget that she was ever involved in. And to me, Ghanima's story is so incredibly tragic because she knew. She had the memories of Jessica, of Chani, of all of the women who had been sidelined for the greater purpose before her, and yet she still couldn't find it in her to break that system, to fight for herself rather than just to sacrifice herself once again for the greater good of the universe. It is the ultimate victimization, self-victimization imposed upon her by the generations of Bene Gesserit voices screaming in her head. She turns herself into yet another tool of the Imperium. By the end of Children of Dune, Ghanima is reduced to a spoil of war. She is ritualistically married off to her brother and given as a lover to another member of the court. She will be the great mother to all of the future generations of Atreides, but she will always be overshadowed by her colossal brother. Really, who can say whether the fate of Ghanima or Leto is to be preferred? Is it better to be the one who was set aside, to be written off by history as a wife and mother, to be handed the fate of the universe and be forced to give it up? Or is it better to be the one who took that burden, who became despised by the universe in order to save it? Who is more pitiable, the priest being forced to perform the blood sacrifice, or the lamb who is slaughtered? Either way, history rarely asks what the lamb thought. The last woman that I want to talk about is, for me at least, the most tragic character in all of Dune, and that is Jessica's second-born child, Alia. From her very first moments on Earth, Alia is second. Although she should have been the firstborn, she should have been the mother to the Messiah, Jessica's love and pride were prioritized, and Paul was born first. Because of this, Alia was in her mother's womb when she underwent the Reverend Mother's spice agony. And unlike Ghanima, she didn't have a twin brother to share this with in the womb. She was alone, being inundated with the thoughts and egos and personality of thousands of her ancestors, and she had no way to cope with this. She had no help in handling it. She had both the male and female ancestral memory poured into her, 1,000 lifetimes of memories, of pain, of loss, before she'd ever had time to live one lifetime of her own. And all of this was in service of Paul, of securing him a place among the Fremen. Before she was even aware of it, Alia was sacrificing herself to make way for her brother's destiny. At the very least, in this moment, it seems Jessica recognizes the cruelty of what she's done. I did it, my poor, unformed, dear little daughter. I brought you into this universe and exposed your awareness to all its varieties without any defenses. But I don't think Jessica could ever be aware of how much damage had already been done. While it was cruel that Jessica was stripped from her family and raised by the Bene Gesserit, Alia also was raised by the Bene Gesserit, but it was all in one instant of the spice agony, thousands of voices clamoring in her head, all at once. Alia too was stripped away from her family, but it was not by the Bene Gesserit organization, but by her own mother's fear of what she had done. Her mother abandoned her at the end of the first book, leaving her to rule the empire without anyone to take care of her. Alia had to be born as an adult, as a goddess ready to be worshipped, as the reverend mother of reverend mothers, meaning that the child inside her never got the chance to grow up. And there are only very precious few times that this inner childishness is allowed to emerge in the story. We see this breakthrough only after a heavy dose of spice and the comforting presence of her lover Duncan. She admits, "I didn't want to be different. I wanted to be able to laugh," she whispered. Tears slid down her cheeks. "But I'm sister to an emperor who's worshipped as a god. People fear me. I never wanted to be feared. I don't want to be part of history," she whispered. "I just wanted to be loved. And to love." Alia continues on this fruitless search for love. She reaches out for a connection to her unreceptive mother. She tries to connect to Paul. She even tries a relationship with Duncan, Idaho. But it's not enough. What's worse is that just like Ghanima, she knows enough to know just how terrible her life is. Alia has the memories of 1,000 childhoods in her mind, and yet was never allowed to experience one of her own. She knows the shape and the direction of Paul's golden path, but her prescience is limited and fleeting, and she is never able to grasp the full picture. She could never quite be Paul. She could never be enough to please herself or the universe. And then when Paul gives up on the golden path at the end of Dune Messiah, the weight of the universe collapses down onto her already trembling shoulders. It is then that Jessica re-enters the scene and witnesses the carnage that she has created. And while she knows that at this point Alia is too far gone, she is abomination, as the Bene Gesserit referred to people who are possessed, Jessica still has room for regret. Jessica knew then that she still loved her daughter, crying out silently against fate, "Alia, oh Alia, I am sorry for my part in your destruction." But that destruction is inevitable. Alone and desperate for any kind of support, she goes inward, the only place where she's ever received any real guidance. And one voice pipes up from the cacophony with an offer too sweet to refuse. "I can serve you in many ways. I can advise you, help you with my counsel. You will be invincible within and without. You will sweep away all opposition. History will forget your brother and cherish you. The future will be yours. You won't let the others take over? They cannot stand against us. Singly we can be overcome. But together, we command." I really don't think it's the power or the reputation that Alia is drawn to here. I think it's just the support. It's the offer of help, something that Alia has never had before. The only problem is that voice that spoke up within her was her maternal grandfather, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. His villainous ways soon begin to show in Alia's actions, his endless lust for power, his conniving, cruel wit. Before long, his male brutality begins to overwhelm Alia, and her delicate position as Reverend Mother from birth is shattered. Her connection to her ancestral past is lost. Her use of the voice has been corrupted, and the most sacred Bene Gesserit trait, this complete integration of the mind and body together, is ruined. Tears sprang from Alia's eyes, forced out against the great Fremen conditioning. Her mouth drew down into a frozen grimace, and she sensed the old battle begin within her skull, reaching out to her fingertips, to her toes. She felt that she had become two people. One looked upon these fleshy contortions with astonishment. The other sought submission to an enormous pain spreading in her chest. Alia is being disintegrated completely. Her mind and her body at war, her empire slipping through her fingers like sand. Her death, while it becomes inevitable, is still tragic. And that's because she also realizes that she's gone too far. She accepts that she is abomination. "Mother," Alia pleaded in her little girl tones. "Mother, what are they doing? What do you want me to do? Help me!" "Help yourself," Leto ordered, and, for just an instant, he saw the shattered presence of his aunt in her eyes, a glaring hopelessness which peered out at him, and was gone. But her body moved, a stick-like, thrusting walk. She wavered, stumbled, veered from her path, but returned to it nearer and nearer, the open window. Now the voice of the old baron raged from her lips. "Stop! Stop it, I say! I command you! Stop it!" But Alia pulled her hands away from her head, clutched the broken casement. In one jerking motion, she pulled herself over the sill and was gone. Not even a screech came from her as she fell. In the room, they heard the crowd shout, the sodden thump, as Alia struck the steps far below. Leto looked at Jessica. "We told you to pity her." Leto's call falls on deaf ears, though. For all that Jessica was apologetic and regretful, she still refuses to take personal responsibility, instead deferring to the larger body. Jessica was particularly bitter at the way the Sisterhood's mythology had trapped Alia. Fear built on fear. The habits of generations had imprinted the fate of abomination upon her. Alia had known no hope. Of course she succumbed. It wasn't just the habits of generations that imprinted abomination upon Alia. It was her mother. And yet Jessica refuses to accept any responsibility for what happened. It is hardwired into her that it wasn't her that caused this tragedy, it was the larger system. And even Alia agrees. Alia saw nothing strange in loving and hating her mother simultaneously. It was a necessity, a required balance without room for guilt or blame. Where could loving or hating stop? Was one to blame the Bene Gesserit because they set the Lady Jessica upon a certain course? The blame game here is a dangerous and probably futile thing, because who can be held accountable? Alia can't find it in herself to blame Jessica, but she also then can't find it in herself to blame the Bene Gesserit, because they're just one step up on this pyramid of cyclical blame, of perpetuated harm. Jessica was just treating Alia the way she had been treated, the way her Reverend Mother had been treated, the way her Reverend Mother before her had been treated, and on and on and on. And without anyone willing to step out and break this cycle, it just continues. Agony building upon agony, forever and ever, for at least the next 10,000 years. While the system of the Bene Gesserit is unique and in its own way empowering, it is just another system. And in Frank Herbert's world, these systems are the root of evil. No matter how subversive, no matter how feminist or how sexist a system is, systems themselves are magnets for corruption. And if left unchecked and unquestioned, they will cause harm. I really don't know that I would call Dune feminist. I mean, it's not sexist, at least on a surface level. The women are confident and strong and empowered, but as always in Frank Herbert's work, a closer look shows just how paper thin that surface level is. On a deeper level, I would say that the men and women of Dune are actually quite equal, in that they are slaves and victims to human-built systems, cycles of trauma, and the convulsions of fate. Listen, I love the men of Dune, and they also have it really tough, but I can't help but feel for the women, who especially in those first 3 and 4-ish books, are constantly being pushed to the side. They're given less page time and less characterization than their male counterparts. I know that they do start to change up these dynamics a little bit, and that books 5 and onward, I believe, are more female-centric, and the Bene Gesserit play a really huge role in what goes on, but I haven't actually read those ones, so I wouldn't know, but feel free to educate me in the comments. I do not care about spoilers for me, myself, and I. Either way, I do find the women of the first 3 Dune books to be a little bit underwritten, which means that I'm very excited to see what they do in the 3rd Dune film. To me, Denis Villeneuve's Dune movies are truly adaptational in the way that they take the original story and adapt it, meaning that some things change. Now, they borrow a lot of the main themes, the main characters, the aesthetics from the book, but they're also doing their own thing. They're transforming it. And one of the biggest liberties that I think they're taking in the movies is with the female characters. Even in those first 2 movies, Jessica has a lot of agency and is more at odds with Paul than she ever really was in the books. I'm not totally on board with the more villainous angle that she's taken in the movies, but that is probably just because I really like the character and I think that she deserves the entire world, despite how much I roasted her in this video. But I will say that giving her a little more villainy and autonomy does keep her from just slipping into Paul's shadow, which is a really exciting change. I have no idea what they're going to do with Alia's character because we've only seen very little things from her, but it does seem like some of her plot from book 3 is going to drift its way into Villeneuve's Messiah adaptation, which is really exciting because I know that Villeneuve is not planning on making a Children of Dune movie. So if we can get a little bit more of Alia's actual plotline, which is my favorite plotline from the books, into the 3rd movie, that would be very exciting. So we'll see how that goes. And then of course there is Chani, and I'm not entirely sure how much of an unpopular opinion this is going to be, but I actually really like the direction that they're taking with her character. She was always probably the toughest female character for me to swallow, because I do like her, but she's really limp. She comes into the story being a fairly fierce character, but then almost immediately she gives that all up just to be a nursemaid and mother to Paul's children. She gives up all of her agency very quickly and never really regains it or gets to have any opinions outside of what Paul wants for her. And that's a little disappointing, especially because she is the only non-Bene Gesserit character that we get, and for the Bene Gesserits, you kind of understand why they subjugate themselves the way that they do, but Chani's not Bene Gesserit, but she still folds into her designated role without any kind of protesting, and it just seems like there could have been more done with her character. Which, it seems like that is what they are going to be doing in the Denis Villeneuve movie. Of course, I can't condone where they're taking her character yet, because I have not seen it, but I am excited by the basic premise of giving Chani a little bit more of a backbone. The books are really male-centric, but it seems like the movies are not. Everything from the stellar casting of incredibly powerful and attractive women in these roles, the writing, and especially the soundtrack with its use of powerful female vocal motifs, it shows that this is a story taking a slightly different direction to what Frank Herbert wrote. These are women that seem like they're going to have more agency, and I am really excited to see how that shapes the story that's going to be written. Also, there is the Dune Prophecy show that is happening. It has not come out as of writing and recording this video, but I am going to watch it as soon as it comes out. So feel free to tell me your opinions in the comments, because I would love to discuss. The women of Dune are tough to stomach. I would almost knee-jerk reaction consider them to be like a little bit sexist, a little bit like, degrading for all of these female characters to just be constantly tortured the way that Frank Herbert tortures them. But also, he does kind of torture all of his characters like that, male and female alike. I think we're just left considering them all to be human, and in Frank Herbert's world, to be human is to be pretty miserable most of the time. So I love that. Genuinely, I don't know why I love that so much, but it is so fascinating to think and talk about. In the comments, let me know who your favorite female character in Dune is. I wasn't able to talk about Irulan or a lot of the other Reverend Mothers or Margot Fenring, so let me know who your favorite is, because I would love to hear it. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, because that really helps me out, and consider subscribing if you want to come back here every week to talk about The Lord of the Rings and other fantasy properties and anything else that I want to talk about. Thank you so much for watching, and although this is a Dune video, I still hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.